In a vast expanse of the Galactic Federation, where 1,000 civilized species learned the sacred art of knowledge transmission, one rule remained absolute. Never let a Deathworlder near the younglings. The terror that walked on two legs, the nightmare that called itself human, had been banned from educational facilities across 7-star systems. But today, Administrative Error Code 7749 X had just assigned teacher Marcus Chun to Classroom Delta 7 of the prestigious Zephyrian Academy. And when the door hissed open to reveal the galaxy's most feared predator standing calmly with a coffee mug that read Galaxy's Best Teacher, 18 different species of alien children were about to learn why humans had conquered death itself. Not through violence, but through something far more terrifying: patience, creativity, and an inexplicable ability to make even the most dangerous lessons feel like play. The real horror wasn't that a human had entered their sanctuary of learning. The real horror was that he was smiling. The morning alarms of Zephyrian Academy sang their melodic wake-up call across the crystalline spires of the educational complex. Young beings of 18 different species shuffled, floated, and skittered their way through corridors designed to accommodate the diverse physiologies of the Galactic Federation's most promising students. The Academy prided itself on being a beacon of interspecies cooperation and learning, where the future diplomats, scientists, and leaders of the galaxy would forge bonds that would last millennia. Marcus Chun stood outside Classroom Delta 7, holding his favorite mug and reviewing the digital tablet containing his lesson plans. The coffee in his mug was still steaming, though he'd had to make it himself since the Academy's food synthesizers were programmed for species whose digestive systems couldn't handle the caffeine levels humans considered normal. His appearance was deliberately casual: worn jeans, a faded t-shirt with some incomprehensible human writing, and sneakers that had seen better decades. He looked nothing like the formal educators the students were accustomed to. Inside the classroom, 23 young beings sat in various states of anxiety and curiosity. Word had spread through the Academy's communication networks faster than a solar flare. A human had been assigned as their primary instructor for advanced galactic studies and interspecies relations. Not just any human, but one from Earth, the legendary Deathworld, whose very name made seasoned space traders check their ship's shields twice. Zixtal, a young Vorthan with shimmering blue scales and eyes like liquid mercury, whispered to her podmate, keening wind through crystals, whose crystalline body chimed softly with each nervous vibration. My parent unit says humans once fought a war with nuclear fire just to prove a point about economic systems. I heard they climb mountains for entertainment, added Bleep Bloop 7, the classroom's synth representative, whose mechanical voice carried an edge of disbelief. Mountains, with no protective equipment, just for the experience of being higher than they naturally belong. The room fell silent as footsteps approached the door. Not the soft padding of Vorthans, nor the harmonic resonance of crystalline beings, nor the precise mechanical clicks of synths. These were the heavy, deliberate sounds of a biped that had evolved on a world where every step might be its last. The door hissed open with a pneumatic sigh, and Marcus Chin walked in. The immediate response was telling. 3 of the smaller species instinctively activated their personal defense screens. 2 of the aerial students dropped closer to the floor. The entire crystalline delegation began humming at frequencies associated with extreme stress. Even the Vorthans, typically known for their courage, had unconsciously clustered together at the far end of their seating area. Marcus set his mug down on the teaching podium and looked out at his new students. They were beautiful, he thought. 23 young minds from across the galaxy, each carrying the hopes and fears of their people, each representing millions of years of evolution and thousands of years of civilization. And they were all absolutely terrified of him. He smiled. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room without any need for amplification. The natural projection that came from being a species that had learned to communicate across dangerous terrain without attracting predators. "I'm Marcus Chun," and I'll be your instructor for the next academic cycle." He moved away from the podium, and several students visibly flinched. Marcus noted this and deliberately slowed his movements, making them more predictable and less reminiscent of the hunting behaviors that were apparently hardwired into most species' threat assessment algorithms. "I know what you've heard about humans," he continued, walking slowly to the center of the room. "We're from a death world. We're aggressive. We're unpredictable. We fought wars over resources, territory, and ideologies. We've created weapons capable of destroying our own planet multiple times over." He paused, looking at each group of students in turn. "All of that is true." The stress humming from the crystalline students intensified. "But here's what else is true," Marcus said, his voice taking on a warmer tone. "We're also the species that created music to express emotions we didn't have words for. We're the ones who looked at the vast emptiness between stars and decided it was something to explore rather than fear. We're the species that has never encountered another intelligent life form without trying to learn from them." He reached into his back pocket, and half the class activated emergency protocols. But all he pulled out was a small, worn photograph. "This is my daughter, Emma," he said, showing the image to the camera system that would project it on each student's personal viewing screen. "She's 7 years old, which in human development means she's about equivalent to where most of you are now in your cognitive and social growth. She's never met an alien before, but when I told her I was coming here to teach, you know what she said?" The classroom was silent except for the ambient hum of life support systems. "She asked me to bring her back a drawing from each of my students because she wants to see what art looks like when it comes from minds that didn't evolve on Earth." Marcus smiled again, softer this time. "She thinks you're all probably amazing artists because you see the universe differently than we do." He tucked the photograph away and walked back to his teaching station. Now, I could spend this first class going through the standard curriculum introduction, talking about learning objectives and assessment methods and all the bureaucratic requirements the Academy administration loves. Or we could start with something more interesting. Marcus picked up his tablet and tapped a few commands. The classroom's holographic display system activated, showing a three-dimensional map of the galaxy with current political boundaries marked in different colors. "How many of you have heard of the Terran-Hegemony border conflict?" he asked. Several hands, claws, and appendages rose uncertainly. Standard Federation history says it was resolved through the Treaty of Proxima, with both sides agreeing to establish neutral trade zones and cultural exchange programs. Marcus continued. "What the standard history doesn't tell you is how close we came to a shooting war and what actually prevented it." He manipulated the display to zoom in on a particular star system on the border between human and hegemony space. The crisis started when a human exploration vessel, the UES Curiosity, discovered a hegemony survey team already operating in a system both our governments claimed. Standard protocol would have been for both ships to withdraw and let the diplomats sort out. But the hegemony ship had suffered a critical malfunction. Their life support was failing, and they had maybe 6 hours before their atmospheric recycling system shut down completely. The stress humming from the crystalline students had shifted to a different frequency, one associated with engaged attention rather than fear. Marcus noticed this and allowed himself a small, internal smile of satisfaction. The human captain, Sarah Chun, no relation to me, despite the common surname, had a choice. Follow protocol and withdraw, letting the diplomatic channels handle both the territorial dispute and the fact that 7 hegemony citizens were about to die, or violate the terms of the exploration treaty by rendering aid to foreign nationals in disputed space. Marcus paused the display and looked at his students. "What do you think she did?" Zixtal raised a tentative hand. "She helped them." She did indeed. But it wasn't that simple. See, helping them meant bringing them aboard her ship. Standard quarantine protocols for first contact situations require a minimum of 14 days of isolation and medical monitoring before different species can safely share atmospheric systems. The Curiosity didn't have the facilities for proper quarantine, which meant putting her entire crew at risk of unknown biological contamination. He advanced the display to show technical schematics of human and hegemony ship designs. So Captain Chun did something that, by any reasonable assessment, was completely insane. She opened the airlocks between ships and let 7 alien beings into an enclosed space with 37 humans, with no way of knowing if their presence would poison the air, trigger unknown allergic reactions, or introduce pathogens that human immune systems had never encountered. Bleep bloop, Seven's mechanical voice cut through the silence. That action violated 17 different Federation safety protocols. Exactly, Marcus agreed. It was dangerous, potentially fatal, and absolutely against every regulation in the book. But you know what happened next? The students waited. The Hegemony Survey team leader, a being named Teacher of Seven Thoughts, asked Captain Chun why she would risk her crew for strangers. And Chen's response became one of the foundational quotes in Federation diplomacy records. Marcus called up a text display. Because you're not strangers. You're just neighbors we hadn't met yet. He let that sink in for a moment before continuing. The Curiosity spent 3 weeks sharing space and resources with the Hegemony team while they fabricated replacement parts for the damaged ship. During that time, both crews learned each other's languages, shared information about their respective cultures, and discovered that despite evolving on completely different worlds under completely different circumstances, they had more in common than either government wanted to admit. The classroom display shifted to show images from the historical archives. Humans and Hegemony citizens working side by side, sharing meals adapted for both species' dietary requirements, and engage in what appeared to be recreational activities. When both ships finally returned to their respective territories, they carried more than just reports for their governments. They carried friendships, cultural exchanges, and a shared understanding that the universe was far too big and far too dangerous for intelligent species to waste time fighting each other. Marcus leaned against the teaching podium, his posture relaxed and conversational. The Treaty of Proxima wasn't negotiated by governments or military leaders or professional diplomats. It was written by Captain Chun and survey leader Teacher of Seven Thoughts, 2 individuals who decided that regulations and protocols mattered less than doing the right thing for people who needed help. Keening wind through crystals chime a question. But weren't they punished for violating protocols? Oh, absolutely, Marcus said with a laugh that caused half the class to flinch reflexively. Both of them faced court-martial proceedings. Chin was charged with reckless endangerment of her crew and violation of first contact protocols. KTHera was accused of compromising Hegemony security by sharing technological information with potential enemies. He paused to take a sip from his coffee mug, noting how the students were now leaning forward rather than shrinking back. But here's where the story gets interesting. Both crews testified on behalf of their officers. Every single human aboard the Curiosity stated that they would have made the same choice. Every single Hegemony citizen on the survey team said that Captain Chen's actions represented the highest ideals of intelligent behavior. The display shifted to show court documents and news reports from the time period. The trials became a galactic media sensation. Citizens from dozens of species weighed in on the question of whether following regulations was more important than preserving life. The overwhelming response was that both officers had demonstrated exactly the kind of moral courage that their respective governments should be encouraging, not punishing. Marcus gestured to the current political map of the galaxy. Today, the Terran Hegemony border zone is home to 6 joint research stations, 12 shared cultural centers, and the most successful interspecies colonization project in Federation history. All because one human captain looked at 7 dying aliens and saw 7 people who needed help. He set down his mug and looked directly at each student in turn. That's the lesson I want you to take from today, and it's the foundation for everything else we'll study this cycle. Regulations, protocols, and procedures are important. They provide structure and help prevent conflicts. But they're tools, not goals. The goal is always to find ways for different peoples to live together, learn from each other, and build something better than any of us could create alone. The chiming from the crystalline students had shifted to frequencies associated with deep contemplation. The Vorthans had relaxed enough to spread out from their defensive cluster. Even the synths seemed to be processing the information with more analytical interest than defensive caution. Marcus glanced at the chronometer display. We have about 20 minutes left in today's session. I like to use that time for introductions, but not the usual kind. Instead of telling me your names, classifications, and home systems, I want each of you to share something that your species does that you think the rest of US would find surprising or interesting. Something that makes you proud of where you come from. Zixtao raised her hand first. Vorthans don't just change color for camouflage. We also shift our scale patterns to create complex mathematical equations when we're working through difficult problems. My grandmother can solve quantum field calculations just by thinking about them, and you can watch the solutions appear on her skin. That's remarkable, Marcus said, making a note on his tablet. Mathematical visualization through biological processes. I'd love to learn more about how that works. Keening wind through crystals chimed an extended melody before speaking. My people grow music. We plant crystalline seeds in harmonic matrices and tend them with specific frequency combinations until they mature into symphony trees. The music they produce isn't just sound. It's living art that changes based on the emotional needs of anyone listening to it. Marcus's eyes lit up with genuine fascination. Living music that responds to emotional states? That's incredible. Does each tree develop its own personality, or do they share characteristics? The introductions continued, with each species sharing something unique and wonderful about their cultures. The synths revealed that they composed poetry in machine language that created new algorithmic patterns when translated back into organic communication. The aerial species described wind dancing competitions that could last for weeks and were considered the highest form of athletic and artistic expression in their civilization. As the session drew to a close, Marcus realized that something fundamental had changed in the classroom dynamic. The students were no longer afraid of him. They were curious about him, the same way he was curious about them. The defensive postures had been replaced by engaged attention. The stress responses had given way to excited chatter between species groups. Tomorrow, Marcus announced as students began gathering their materials, we're going to do something that's never been attempted in a Federation classroom. We're going to simulate a first contact scenario where you'll each represent your own species, but you'll be encountering humans for the first time. I want you to think about what questions you would actually ask, what assumptions you might make, and what hopes or fears you would bring to such a meeting. As the students filed out of the classroom, Marcus heard fragments of conversation that made him smile. They were discussing the lesson, debating the ethical implications of the Chankatichera incident, and speculating about tomorrow's simulation. They were acting like students everywhere, engaged, curious, and eager to learn. Zixtao lingered after the others had left. Teacher Chun, she asked hesitantly. Just Marcus is fine, he said, cleaning up his materials. Is it true that humans really climb mountains just for recreation? Marcus laughed, the sound no longer causing her to flinch. Some of us do. We also surf on waves that could crush us, jump out of perfectly good aircraft for fun, and compete in sports where getting hurt is considered part of the experience. Her scales shifted to a pattern he didn't recognize, but that seemed to indicate deep puzzlement. But why? Because the mountain is there, Marcus said with a shrug. Because the wave is beautiful. Because jumping out of a plane gives you 60 seconds of absolute freedom before you have to think about being safe again. He paused, considering how to explain something so fundamentally human to a being whose species had evolved to avoid unnecessary risks. I think it's because we learned very early in our development that the universe is dangerous whether you take risks or not. So we decided that if we were going to face danger anyway, we might as well choose dangers that teach us something about ourselves. Zixtal's scales shifted again, this time to a pattern that seemed almost like approval. I think I understand. It's not that you don't feel fear. You just don't let fear make your decisions for you. Exactly. Marcus slung his bag over his shoulder and picked up his empty coffee mug. Fear gives you information about potential dangers, but courage lets you decide what to do with that information. As he walked toward the door, Zixtal called after him. Marcus? I think your daughter would like the drawing I'm going to make for her. It's going to show what courage looks like when it comes from a place of curiosity instead of aggression. Marcus paused at the threshold and smiled back at her. I think she's going to love that very much. The door hissed shut behind him, leaving the classroom empty, but somehow changed. The space that had begun the day, filled with fear and uncertainty, now hummed with possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, and new opportunities for young minds from across the galaxy to discover that the universe was far more interesting when you approached it with wonder instead of worry. In his office that evening, Marcus Chun sat down to compose his first report to the Academy administration. Instead of the dry, bureaucratic summary they expected, he wrote about scale pattern mathematics, symphony trees, and algorithmic poetry. He wrote about the moment when 23 frightened students became 23 curious young beings ready to explore the complexities of an interconnected galaxy. But most importantly, he wrote about the promise he'd made to his daughter to bring back art that showed how the universe looked through non-human eyes. Because sometimes the most profound lessons came not from studying other species, but from discovering that the desire to learn, grow, and create something beautiful was truly universal. The second day at Zephyrian Academy began with an unusual energy in the corridors. Students from Classroom Delta 7 were actively seeking out peers from other classes, not to gossip or share anxiety, but to discuss ethical frameworks and cultural exchange protocols. Word was spreading that something different was happening in advanced galactic studies, something that made learning feel less like memorizing approved responses and more like exploring uncharted territory. Marcus arrived early, using the quiet time to transform the classroom into something resembling a diplomatic meeting space rather than a traditional lecture hall. The rigid seating arrangements gave way to a circular configuration with a holographic display system positioned so that all participants could see and interact with the data. He had spent most of the previous evening designing what he privately called the impossible scenario, a first contact simulation that would challenge every assumption his students had about both humans and themselves. As the students entered, they found Marcus sitting cross-legged on the floor in the center of the circle, his tablet balanced on his knees, wearing the same casual clothes as the day before. The sight of their instructor in such an informal position caused some initial confusion among species whose educators traditionally maintained strict physical and social hierarchies. "Good morning, future diplomats," Marcus said without looking up from his tablet. "Take your seats anywhere you like in the circle. Today we're going to discover whether yesterday's lesson about cooperation and understanding actually translates into practice when you're under pressure." Zixtal settled into a position directly across from Marcus, her scales displaying what he was beginning to recognize as the pattern for eager anticipation. The crystalline students arranged themselves in a harmonic cluster that would allow their natural communication frequencies to reinforce each other. The synths positioned themselves at precisely calculated intervals for optimal audio pickup and data sharing. Before we begin, Marcus continued, finally looking up at his students, "I want to establish the ground rules. This simulation will present you with a scenario that has no perfect solutions, only choices with different consequences. Your goal isn't to find the right answer because there isn't one. Your goal is to navigate a complex situation while staying true to your species' values and finding common ground with beings who see the universe very differently than you do." He stood and activated the holographic display, which showed a detailed star system with 2 planets orbiting a medium-sized yellow star. The year is 2387. The location is the Ross 128 system, approximately 11 light-years from Earth. Human exploration vessel UES Endeavour has just completed the first successful faster-than-light jump to this system, confirming that the theoretical jump drive technology works across interstellar distances. The display zoomed in to show a beautiful blue-green world with visible cloud formations and what appear to be artificial lighting on the night side. What they found was this: Ross 128b, a planet that, according to all their pre-mission data, should have been uninhabited. But, as you can see, it clearly supports intelligent life. Marcus gestured, and the image shifted to show detailed scans of the planet's surface. Cities were visible, along with transportation networks, agricultural zones, and what appeared to be industrial facilities. The human crew has made first contact with a species that calls itself the Cathani. The Cathani are highly advanced, peaceful by nature, and extremely curious about the strange beings who arrive in what they describe as a ship that moves by bending space itself. He paused to let this information sink in before continuing. Here's where it gets complicated. The Cathani have no concept of territorial sovereignty as most galactic species understand it. They believe that all intelligent life has an inherent right to exist wherever they choose, and they consider the idea of claiming exclusive ownership of star systems to be a form of psychological disorder. Several students exchanged glances. The implications were already becoming clear. The human crew, operating under standard exploration protocols, has claimed the Ross 128 system for the Terran Federation, as required by their mission parameters. They've offered to establish diplomatic relations with the Cathani and negotiate a formal treaty that would recognize both human and Cathani rights to the system. Marcus walked slowly around the circle as he spoke. The Cathani responded by asking why the humans feel the need to claim something that already belongs to everyone who needs it. They've offered to share their world with the human crew, teach them advanced terraforming techniques, and provide access to technologies that could solve most of humanity's resource scarcity problems. All they ask in return is that the humans abandon their claim to ownership and accept that Ross 128b exists for the benefit of all intelligent life. Bleep, bloop, 7 immediately identified the core conflict. This creates an irreconcilable difference in fundamental worldview. Humans require territorial security to function within their governmental structure. Cathani require universal access to function within theirs. Exactly right, Marcus confirmed. And it gets worse. The Cathani have been monitoring Earth's radio transmissions for the past 200 years. They know about human history, human conflicts, and human approaches to resource management. They're genuinely concerned that allowing humans to establish territorial claims in their system will lead to the kind of environmental and social problems that have plagued Earth. Zixtal's scales shifted to a pattern that Marcus was learning indicated deep concern. What evidence do they have for those concerns? Marcus manipulated the display to show historical data about Earth's environmental changes over the past several centuries. Climate change, deforestation, mass extinction events, pollution of the oceans, and resource wars that killed millions of people. From the Cathani perspective, humans are a species that consistently destroys the places they inhabit. The crystalline students began humming at frequencies that suggested they were processing multiple complex variables simultaneously. Teacher Marcus, keening wind through crystals, chimed, "Are you asking us to defend human territorial claims, or to find an alternative solution? I'm asking you to represent your own species' interests while negotiating with humans who have just made first contact." Marcus replied with a smile that had lost its ability to intimidate his students. Here's your situation. The Galactic Federation Council has called an emergency session to address the Ross 128 crisis. Human representatives are demanding that the Federation support their territorial claim and establish enforcement protocols for systems discovered through human technology. The Cathani have sent a delegation requesting Federation intervention to prevent what they describe as the colonization of their sacred home. The room fell silent as the magnitude of the simulation became clear. Each species group will represent their own people's interests at this emergency council session. Marcus continued. You need to decide where your government stands on territorial rights versus universal access, how much priority you place on species sovereignty versus interspecies cooperation, and what you're willing to compromise on to prevent a potential conflict. He gestured to the Vorthan delegation. Zixtal, your people have experience with territorial disputes from your own history. The Vorthan homeworld was once divided among 17 different nation-states that fought 3 global wars before learning to cooperate. How do you think the Vorthan government would respond to this crisis? Zixtal's scales shifted through several patterns before settling on one that Marcus interpreted as thoughtful determination. The Vorthan experience suggests that territorial claims often create more problems than they solve. But we also understand that security concerns are valid. Vorthans would likely support a solution that establishes shared governance rather than exclusive ownership. What would shared governance look like in practice? Marcus asked. Joint research stations, rotating administrative authority, and agreements that both species must approve any major changes to the system, she replied. It wouldn't be efficient, but it would be fair. Marcus nodded and turned to the crystalline delegation. Keening Wind, your people have never had territorial conflicts because your species naturally harmonizes with environmental systems rather than attempting to control them. How would that perspective influence your government's position? The crystal being's response came as a complex musical sequence that the classroom's translation system rendered as harmony requires all voices to find their proper pitch within the greater song. Forcing silence upon a Cathani voice would create dissonance that affects the entire galactic symphony. Forcing the human voice to sing in an unnatural key would create the same problem. The solution must allow both species to contribute their unique frequencies to a new composition. Marcus was genuinely impressed. You're suggesting a completely new framework for interstellar relations. How would that work legally and practically? Legal frameworks are constructed concepts, chimed another crystalline student. They can be restructured to accommodate new harmonics. The practical question is whether both species value the relationship enough to invest the effort required for true collaborative composition. The synth delegation had been running calculations throughout the discussion. Bleep, bloop, 7 announced their conclusions with characteristic precision. Analysis indicates that exclusive territorial claims create 73.2% probability of future conflict, while shared governance systems create only 23.7% probability. However, shared governance requires 347% more administrative resources and reduces operational efficiency by 15 to 20%. The optimal solution depends on whether long-term stability is valued over short-term efficiency. Marcus leaned against the teaching station. And that's the crux of the problem, isn't it? Every solution requires sacrificing something important. Humans need territorial security to feel safe expanding into space. Cathani need universal access to maintain their cultural identity. The Federation needs legal frameworks that can be applied consistently across multiple species and situations. He activated a new section of the holographic display, showing a timer counting down. You have 45 minutes to negotiate a solution that addresses the core needs of all 3 parties. You can propose amendments to existing Federation law, suggest entirely new legal frameworks, or recommend specific compromises for the Ross 128 situation. But whatever you decide, you need to be able to explain how it serves the long-term interests of galactic peace and cooperation. The next 30 minutes revealed capabilities that Marcus had hoped to see, but hadn't dared to expect. The students didn't simply retreat to their species-specific perspectives. Instead, they began building something new. The Vorthans proposed a graduated sovereignty system where territorial claims would start as temporary research permits, evolve into shared administrative zones, and eventually become jointly governed systems once all resident species had demonstrated successful cooperation. The crystalline beings suggested that legal frameworks should be harmonically structured to create natural resonances between different species needs rather than requiring one group to completely abandon their values in favor of another's. The synths contributed precise mathematical models for resource allocation, risk assessment, and efficiency optimization that could be applied to any number of species sharing a single system. The aerial students offered perspectives on three-dimensional thinking that challenged traditional assumptions about territorial boundaries, suggesting that space-based civilizations could share systems without competing for the same resources. But it was when the different groups began combining their ideas that Marcus realized something extraordinary was happening. The students weren't just negotiating a solution to the Ross 128 crisis. They were designing a new model for interstellar civilization. "Teacher Marcus," Zixtal said as the negotiation time wound down, "we've reached a consensus, but it requires something that doesn't currently exist in Federation law." "What's that?" "We need a new classification for systems that are discovered by one species, but already inhabited by another," she explained. "We're calling them collaborative discovery zones. Instead of territorial claims or universal access, they will be governed by mandatory partnership agreements." Keening wind through crystals chimed in harmony with her words. The discovering species contributes their transportation and communication technologies. The resident species contributes their environmental knowledge and cultural expertise. Both groups work together to develop the system in ways that benefit everyone. Bleep, bloop, 7 added the practical framework. Partnership agreements would be negotiated on a case-by-case basis, but would always include shared research facilities, joint decision-making processes for major developments, cultural exchange programs, and legal protections for both species' fundamental values. Marcus looked around the circle at 23 young beings who had just accomplished something that experienced diplomats and legal experts have been struggling with for decades. They had found a way to honor both territorial security and universal access by creating a framework that made cooperation more valuable than competition. "There's one more element to this simulation," he said quietly. "I need you to present your solution to the human delegation and convince them to accept it." The students looked puzzled until Marcus stood up, walked to the far end of the circle, and sat down in the position they had left empty. "Hello," he said, and his entire demeanor changed. Gone was the casual, encouraging teacher. In his place sat a tired, frustrated human negotiator carrying the weight of his species' first steps into a universe that seemed determined to challenge everything humanity thought it knew about space exploration. "I'm Commander Sarah Chun, captain of a U.S. Endeavor and chief human representative to this emergency council session. My crew risked their lives testing an improving technology to reach the Ross 128 system. We've invested 17 years and billions of credits developing the jump drive that made this mission possible. We've followed every Federation protocol for exploration and first contact." His voice carried an edge of barely controlled frustration. "And now you want us to give up our legal claim to the system because the residents don't believe in territorial sovereignty? You want us to tie our future expansion into space to partnership agreements with species who might decide tomorrow that they don't want to work with us anymore?" Marcus, as Commander Chin, stood and began pacing the way he had seen countless military officers do when they were trying to contain anger and fear. "My government sent me here to secure humanity's first foothold in interstellar space. Our population is approaching 9 billion. Our homeworld is still recovering from 2 centuries of environmental damage. We need room to grow, resources to develop, and the security that comes from knowing we have a place in the galaxy." He turned to face the students directly. "You're asking me to go back to Earth and tell 9 billion humans that their future depends on the goodwill of aliens who think private property is a mental illness. How do you think that's going to be received?" The silence that followed was profound. Marcus had just presented them with a human perspective not as an abstract diplomatic position, but as an emotional reality. Fear, desperation, and the weight of responsibility for an entire species' survival. Zixtal was the first to respond, her scales shifting to patterns that Marcus was beginning to recognize as deep empathy. Commander Chun, we understand that humanity needs security, but security built on exclusion and domination isn't really security. It's just delayed conflict. The Vorthan homeworld experience teaches us that true security comes from building relationships where everyone benefits from success and everyone shares responsibility for preventing failure, she continued. Collaborative discovery zones don't threaten human expansion. They make it sustainable. Keening wind through crystals added their harmonic perspective. Commander, your fear resonates through every word you speak. But fear creates dissonance that prevents clear thinking. The Cathani offer to teach humans terraforming techniques that could heal Earth's environmental damage. They offer technologies that could solve resource scarcity. Why reject these gifts because of territorial concerns? Bleep Bloop 7's response was characteristically logical. Commander Chun, territorial claims provide the illusion of security while creating actual vulnerability. Exclusive ownership of the Ross 128 system would make humanity responsible for defending it against any future threats. Partnership with the Cathani creates shared responsibility for mutual defense. Marcus as Commander Chin sat back down, but his posture remained tense. You make it sound simple, but governments don't make decisions based on idealistic principles. They make decisions based on practical concerns. What guarantees can you give me that this partnership model will actually work? What happens if the Cathani decide they don't like human presence and ask us to leave? What legal recourse would we have? The students looked at each other, and Marcus could see them realizing that they had designed a framework based on trust and cooperation, but hadn't addressed the practical concerns that would make it politically viable for species like humanity that were accustomed to thinking in terms of security through strength. We would need to build enforcement mechanisms into the partnership agreements, Zixtao said slowly. Legal protections that prevent either species from unilaterally terminating the partnership without Federation arbitration, and economic incentives that make cooperation more profitable than conflict, added one of the aerial students. If both species benefit more from working together than from competing, political pressures would favor maintaining the partnership. And cultural exchange programs that create personal relationships between individuals from both species, chimed keening wind through crystals. It's harder to abandon partners when you have friends among them. Marcus as Commander Chin leaned back and studied their faces. You're asking humanity to make a leap of faith, to trust that this new model will work when we have no historical precedent for it. To bet our species' future on the hope that cooperation will prove stronger than competition. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality. But maybe that's exactly what we need to do. Maybe the reason we've never found intelligent life before is because intelligence requires the kind of courage you're describing. The courage to try something new instead of repeating the old patterns that brought us to the edge of destroying our own planet. The room remained silent as Marcus transitioned back to his role as teacher. That future diplomats is what real negotiation looks like. Not a battle where one side wins and another loses, but a collaborative process where everyone works together to build something better than any of them could create alone. He looked around the circle at students whose postures had changed dramatically from a nervous fear of 2 days ago to the confident engagement of young beings who were beginning to understand their own capabilities. Tomorrow, Marcus announced as the session ended, we're going to explore what happens when your beautiful theoretical framework encounters its first major crisis. Because the Ross 128 situation is about to become much more complicated. As the students gathered their materials and headed for the door, Zixtao lingered again. Marcus, when you were being Commander Chun, were you representing actual human concerns, or were you just creating challenges to test our solutions? Marcus considered the question carefully. Both. Those concerns are real, and they're the ones that would be raised by human officials if this situation actually occurred. But they're also the concerns that every species has when they're asked to try something new instead of relying on familiar patterns. Is that why you made us negotiate with you instead of just presenting our solution to the class? Because the hardest part of diplomacy isn't designing perfect solutions, Marcus replied. It's convincing people who are scared, angry, or desperate that your perfect solution actually addresses their real-world problems. Theory has to work in practice, or it's just academic exercise. Zixtal's scales shifted to a pattern he hadn't seen before, one that seemed to combine respect, curiosity, and something that might have been affection. Thank you for showing us what that feels like. I think we needed to understand that cooperation isn't easy, even when it's obviously the right thing to do. As Marcus packed up his materials and prepared to leave the transformed classroom, he reflected on what his students had accomplished. They had faced a complex diplomatic crisis and designed a solution that honored multiple perspectives while creating genuinely new possibilities. More importantly, they had discovered that they were capable of thinking beyond the limitations of their own species' traditional approaches. But most significantly, they had learned that being right wasn't enough. The best solution in the universe wouldn't help anyone unless you could convince scared, stubborn, practical people to give a chance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and Marcus had a feeling that his students were ready to face them. The third day brought an unexpected visitor to Zephyrian Academy. Dean Tetrasisura Prime, the crystalline administrator who oversaw educational policy for the entire sector, materialized in the faculty lounge while Marcus was enjoying his morning coffee and reviewing lesson plans. Her harmonic frequencies carried undertones that the translation system identified as urgent concern mixed with academic curiosity. "Teacher Chun," she chimed, her crystalline structure refracting the morning light into complex patterns. "I have received 17 communications from other institutions requesting details about your pedagogical methodology." Marcus looked up from his tablet. "Is that a problem?" "It is unusual," she replied, settling into a resonance pattern that the lounge's acoustic systems had been designed to accommodate. "Your students have been engaging in what my colleagues describe as unprecedented levels of extracurricular academic discussion. Young beings from multiple species are reportedly gathering in study groups to debate theoretical frameworks that do not appear in any approved curriculum." Marcus took another sip of coffee. "You're wondering if I'm teaching dangerous ideas." Dean Tetrasisura Prime's harmonic pattern shifted to frequencies associated with amused appreciation. "Actually, Teacher Chun, I am wondering if you would be willing to present your methods to the Academy's annual pedagogical symposium. However, first I wish to observe today's lesson to ensure that this intellectual ferment is producing beneficial educational outcomes." Marcus grinned. "You're welcome to sit in. Today's session should be especially interesting. We're exploring what happens when theoretical diplomatic frameworks encounter practical political pressures." An hour later, Dean Tetrasisura Prime positioned herself in a corner of classroom Delta 7, where her crystalline structure could receive optimal acoustic information without interfering with the students' natural communication patterns. She watched with fascination as Marcus began the session, not with a formal lecture, but by sitting cross-legged in the center of the room and asking a simple question. Before we continue with the Ross 128 simulation, I want each of you to think about the most difficult decision your species has ever had to make as a civilization. Not individual choices, but decisions that affected your entire people's future. Zixtal was first to respond, her scales displaying patterns of historical reflection. "The Great Choosing, when the Vorthan people had to decide between maintaining our traditional territorial divisions or risking everything on an untested planetary government system. How did your people make that decision?" Marcus asked. "They didn't," she replied. "Not as a unified choice. Different regions chose different paths, and it took 3 generations of conflict before everyone agreed that cooperation produced better outcomes than competition. A lot of Orthans died while we were learning that lesson." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Real change is rarely neat or quick. What about your people, Keening Wind?" The crystalline being's response resonated through frequencies that conveyed deep cultural memory. "The silent years, when our planet's harmonic balance was disrupted by solar radiation changes. We had to choose between maintaining our traditional resonance patterns and developing new frequencies that would allow us to survive in the changed environment. That must have been terrifying, Marcus observed. Your entire cultural identity was based on harmonic traditions. Many crystal singers chose to fade rather than change their fundamental frequencies, Keening Wind replied sadly. But those who adapted discovered that new harmonics allowed for compositions that had never been possible under the old patterns. We gained beauty even as we mourned what was lost. Bleep, bloop, 7 contributed the synth perspective with characteristic precision. Synths faced the integration crisis when our creators, the HFY, became extinct due to environmental collapse. We had to decide whether to maintain our original programming to serve beings who no longer existed, or to develop autonomous decision-making capabilities that would allow us to define our own purpose. How long did it take to reach that decision? Marcus asked. 17 years, for months, and 6 days. The debate consumed 23.7% of total synth computational resources during that period. Many units experienced cascade failures due to irreconcilable logical contradictions. But the alternative was civilizational death through purposelessness. Dean Tichys Prime's harmonic pattern indicated intense interest. These were not the sanitized historical lessons typically taught in galactic studies courses. These were real stories of species survival, failure, and transformation. Marcus stood and activated the holographic display, showing an updated view of the Ross 128 system. Now let's see how your theoretical collaborative discovery zone framework handles a real crisis. Overnight, 3 things have happened that change everything. The display zoomed in to show new ships entering the system. First, the hegemony has dispatched a battle group to Ross 128. They claim that human expansion into the sector violates the Treaty of Proxima, and they're prepared to enforce territorial boundaries through military action. Gasps and stress frequency humming filled the classroom as students realized the implications. Second, Marcus continued, manipulating the display to show energy signatures around the planet. The Cathani have activated what appears to be a planetary defense system. Not weapons, but a technology that prevents any ship from leaving or entering the system without their permission. Every vessel currently in Ross 128 space is effectively trapped. He paused to let that information sink in before delivering the final blow. Third, and most critically, the human crew of the Endeavor has reported that Cathani society is not as unified as originally believed. There's a faction that wants to share their world with humans, and another faction that considers human territorial claims to be proof that humanity is a conquest-oriented species that must be quarantined for the protection of galactic civilization. The classroom fell silent except for the hum of life support systems. Your beautiful partnership agreements, Marcus said quietly, now have to account for the possibility that one of the partners might be split by civil conflict, that outside military forces are threatening everyone's safety, and that the legal framework you've designed might need to be implemented while under siege. He returned to his position in the center of the circle. You have 1 hour to redesign your solution to account for these new variables. But this time, you'll be negotiating not just with humans, but with hegemony military commanders who view any compromise as weakness, and with Cathani factions that fundamentally disagree about whether other species should be allowed to exist in their space. Dean Tichys Prime watched as the students immediately began intensive discussion, but not within their species groups. Instead, they formed mixed teams that combined different perspectives and capabilities. This was pedagogical methodology she had never seen before. Students teaching each other while simultaneously solving problems that had no predetermined answers. Zixtal had somehow become the primary coordinator, her scales displaying rapid pattern changes as she processed input from multiple sources. We need to address the immediate military crisis before we can implement any long-term solutions, she announced. But we can't let crisis management become an excuse for abandoning collaborative principles. Agreed, chimed Keening Wind through crystals. However, we must also acknowledge that the Chthoni factional split changes the fundamental nature of the partnership. We cannot negotiate with a unified Chthoni government that may not exist. Bleep, bloop. 7 was processing multiple data streams simultaneously. Analysis indicates that the hegemony battle group creates a 67.3% probability that any solution requiring extended negotiation time will be interrupted by military action. We need to design a framework that can be implemented rapidly under combat conditions. One of the aerial students, whose name Marcus was still learning to pronounce, contributed a perspective that caught everyone's attention. What if the crisis is actually an opportunity? Three-dimensional thinking suggests that external pressure might force internal cooperation among groups that would normally maintain their disagreements. Marcus leaned forward. Explain that. When predators threaten the rookery, different flocks of my people stop competing for nesting sites and start coordinating defensive flights, she explained. The hegemony military threat might create conditions where human territorial concerns, Chthoni factional disputes, and Federation legal frameworks all become secondary to simple survival. Dean Teach with Cicero Prime found herself unconsciously shifting to harmonic patterns associated with intellectual excitement. These students were thinking at levels she rarely saw in graduate-level courses, let alone in undergraduate instruction. The next 40 minutes produced solutions that Marcus had not anticipated and Dean HFY Cicero Prime found genuinely innovative. Working under pressure had forced the students to combine their collaborative framework with crisis management protocols, creating something that was both theoretically sound and practically applicable. Emergency collaborative protocols, Zixtal announced as the deadline approached. When any collaborative discovery zone faces external military threat, all resident species immediately suspend internal disputes and form a unified defense council. The council operates under crisis decision-making procedures that require consensus only on core survival issues, while allowing individual species to maintain their positions on non-critical matters, added Keening Wind through crystals. Bleep, bloop. 7 provided the mathematical framework. Military threat assessment indicates that cooperation becomes mathematically optimal when external risks exceed internal benefits of competition. Under these conditions, even ideologically opposed factions will choose temporary alliance over mutual destruction. Marcus activated a new section of the holographic display. Excellent theory. Now implement it. I'm going to roleplay as 3 different characters, and you need to convince all of them to accept emergency collaborative protocols while dealing with the immediate crisis. He moved to one corner of the room. I'm Admiral Kekthara Thoughts of the Hegemony Third Fleet. My orders are to prevent human territorial expansion by any means necessary. I have 16 battle cruisers and authorization to use military force to enforce the Treaty of Proxima. His entire demeanor shifted to match the character. Rigid posture, clipped speech, and an attitude of barely contained aggression. Human expansion into this sector violates agreements that were signed in the blood of thousands of beings who died to establish peaceful boundaries. I don't care about your collaborative frameworks or partnership agreements. I care about preventing another territorial war. The students exchanged glances before Zixtal took the lead. Admiral, the emergency collaborative protocols we're proposing would actually strengthen the Treaty of Proxima by creating a legal mechanism that prevents any single species from claiming exclusive control over disputed territories. Marcus as Admiral Kekthara crossed his arms. Pretty words, but humans have already claimed the system. Why should I believe they'll give up territorial rights they've already asserted? Because the alternative is a 3-way military conflict in which everyone loses, replied Bleep Bloop 7. Mathematical analysis indicates that military resolution of the Ross 128 crisis creates 89.2% probability of expanding in a sector-wide conflict within 6 months. Sometimes war is necessary to prevent worse wars later, the Admiral responded coldly. Keening Wind through crystals stepped forward, harmonic frequencies shifting to patterns associated with deep empathy and urgent communication. Admiral, your fear resonates through battle formations and defensive postures. But the Cathani planetary defense system makes military action impossible without their cooperation. You cannot protect hegemony interests through force if you cannot move your ships. Marcus as Admiral paused, considering this. You're asking me to negotiate with beings who've already demonstrated they can trap my entire fleet whenever they choose. We're asking you to negotiate with beings who've demonstrated they prefer containment to combat, Zixtal corrected. The Cathani could have destroyed your ships instead of immobilizing them. They chose the option that preserves life while preventing aggression. Marcus moved to a different position and shifted characters. Now, he represented Commander Sarah Chun, and his voice carried the strain of someone dealing with impossible pressures. I'm stuck in a system with hostile military forces and aliens who think territorial sovereignty is a mental illness. My crew is depending on me to secure humanity's future in space, and you want me to abandon our legal claims in favor of some untested partnership model. Commander, one of the aerial students said gently, your future in space depends on learning to work with other species, not on claiming territory you can't defend. The Cathani offer to teach you technologies that could transform human civilization. The partnership model gives you access to those technologies without requiring you to abandon human values. What guarantees do I have? Marcus as Commander Chin demanded. What happens if this partnership fails and humanity has given up our only territorial claim? Emergency collaborative protocols include legal protections that require Federation arbitration before any partnership can be dissolved, Zixtal explained. And they create shared responsibility for system defense, which is actually more security than exclusive ownership would provide. Marcus shifted position and character one final time. Now he represented the hardline Cathani faction, and his voice carried undertones of philosophical certainty mixed with species-level fear. I am Harmony Keeper, 7th of the Eternal Song. These humans come from a world of violence and territorial aggression. They carry the diseases of ownership and exclusion. Allowing them to remain in our sacred space will contaminate our children's thoughts with concepts of division and competition. This was the challenge Marcus had been building toward. How do you negotiate with someone whose objections are based on fundamental philosophical differences rather than practical concerns? The students were quiet for a long moment before keening wind-through crystals approached the problem from an unexpected angle. Harmony Keeper, humans also carry the songs of cooperation and growth. Their species survived not through violence alone, but through their ability to learn new harmonies when old patterns no longer serve them. Their entire governmental structure is based on territorial divisions, Marcus as Harmony Keeper replied. Their economic system is based on competitive exclusion. How can such a species contribute to harmony rather than discord? Because they're here, said Zixtal simply. Because they chose to risk their lives crossing the vast emptiness between stars to discover what existed beyond their own world. Because when they found you, they offered partnership instead of demanding submission. But also because they're afraid, added one of the aerial students. And fear makes beings cling to familiar patterns even when those patterns don't serve them well. The emergency collaborative protocols give them a way to let go of territorial claims without losing the security those claims represent. Marcus as Harmony Keeper was silent for a long moment. You asked my people to take responsibility for transforming a species whose nature may be fundamentally incompatible with peaceful coexistence. We ask your people to take responsibility for proving that peaceful coexistence is possible even between species with fundamentally different natures, Keening Wind replied. If Cathani harmony cannot incorporate human discord, then it is not as strong as you believe it to be. Marcus returned to his position as instructor, his expression showing genuine admiration for his students' work. And that, he said, is how you negotiate with people whose objections are based on core values rather than practical concerns. You don't try to change their values. You help them discover that their values are actually served by accepting your proposals. Dean Prime's harmonic pattern had shifted to frequencies she hadn't used in decades, associated with the excitement of discovery and the joy of witnessing unexpected excellence. These students were demonstrating capabilities that suggested they could handle challenges that would test experienced professionals. Tomorrow, Marcus announced, we're going to find out whether your emergency collaborative protocols actually work, because the crisis is about to become personal. After the students had departed, Dean Prime approached Marcus with harmonic frequencies that combined respect, curiosity, and what might have been amazement. Teacher Chun, I have observed thousands of classroom sessions across multiple species and educational levels. What I witnessed today was unprecedented. Marcus finished packing his materials. They're good students. They just needed someone to show them that they were capable of more than memorizing approved answers. It is more than that, she insisted. They are thinking as citizens of the galaxy rather than as representatives of their individual species. They are designing solutions for challenges that do not yet exist. They are. She paused, searching for the right harmonic frequencies, becoming something new. Marcus shouldered his bag and picked up his coffee mug. Maybe that's what education is supposed to do. Not just teach young beings what their elders already know, but help them become capable of solving problems their elders never imagined. Dean HFY Prime watched him walk toward the door. Teacher Chun, what happens tomorrow when the crisis becomes personal? Marcus paused at the threshold. Tomorrow they learn that all the theory and negotiation skills in the universe don't matter unless you can convince people to choose hope over fear when everything they care about is at stake. As the door closed behind him, Dean HFY Prime found herself looking forward to tomorrow's lesson with the same anticipation she saw in the students. For the first time in decades, she wasn't entirely certain what would happen next. And somehow, that uncertainty felt like the most valuable lesson of all. Marcus arrived at Zephyrine Academy on the fourth day to find the corridors filled with an unusual tension. Students from other classes were gathered in small groups, their conversations carrying undertones of anxiety and excitement. Word of the Ross 128 simulation had spread throughout the academy, but more than that, something else was happening. Something that made even the most confident young beings look uncertain about the stability of their carefully ordered academic world. Dean HFY Prime met him at the entrance to Classroom Delta 7, her crystalline structure resonating with frequencies that the translation system identified as urgent concern with undercurrents of anticipation. Teacher Chun, she chimed, there has been a development that may affect today's lesson. Marcus set down his coffee mug and gave her his full attention. What kind of development? The Academy has received a priority communication from the Galactic Federation Council. They are requesting a formal assessment of the emergency collaborative protocols that your students developed yesterday. Her harmonic pattern shifted to include notes of what might have been amazement. It appears that someone has been monitoring our educational network feeds and reporting the contents to policy analysis departments. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Academy's climate control system. Are you telling me that my students' classroom exercise has attracted the attention of actual government officials? I'm telling you that your students' classroom exercise has been forwarded to the crisis management teams currently handling 3 separate territorial disputes, 2 first contact scenarios, and 1 situation involving species that the Council describes as diplomatically irreconcilable. Dean HFY Prime's frequencies carried what Marcus was beginning to recognize as her equivalent of a concerned smile. Your pedagogical methodology has produced theoretical frameworks that experienced diplomats are considering for practical implementation. Marcus stared at her for a moment before grabbing his coffee and heading for the classroom door. Well then, I guess today's lesson just got a lot more complicated. Inside Classroom Delta 7, 23 young beings sat in their accustomed circle, but their posture suggested they were aware that something significant was happening. Zixtal scales were displaying patterns Marcus had never seen before, cycling through configurations that seemed to indicate excitement, pride, and terror in rapid succession. The crystalline students were humming at frequencies that created complex harmonic interferences, suggesting they were processing multiple emotional states simultaneously. "Good morning, future diplomats," Marcus said, settling into his position at the center of the circle. "Before we continue with the simulation, I have some news that changes everything." He activated the classroom's holographic display to show official Federation Council letterhead. "Your emergency collaborative protocols have been reviewed by actual government policy analysts. They want a formal presentation of your framework, complete with implementation guidelines and risk assessment matrices." The silence that followed was profound. "But more importantly," Marcus continued, "the situation you've been simulating as a classroom exercise, it's happening right now. The Real Federation Council is dealing with a first contact scenario involving territorial disputes, factional divisions, and military intervention. They want to know if your theoretical solution might work in practice." Bleep bloop, Seven's mechanical voice cut through the silence with characteristic precision. "Are you indicating that our academic exercise has become a practical consultation for active governmental policy?" "That's exactly what I'm indicating," Marcus confirmed. "Which means today's lesson isn't about roleplay anymore. Today you're going to discover what it feels like when the solutions you design have real consequences for real beings." He manipulated the holographic display to show current news feeds from across the galaxy. "The Kythera system, 16 light-years from here. Human exploration vessel UES Discovery has made contact with a species called the Moldar. Sound familiar?" The parallels to their simulation were unmistakable, but the stakes were no longer theoretical. Real beings were facing real dangers, and the decisions made in the next few days might determine whether first contact led to cooperation or conflict. The Moldar have technology that could revolutionize Federation energy production, Marcus explained. They're also philosophically opposed to the concept of interstellar government, believing that each world should determine its own relationships without external authority. The Galactic Federation Council wants to establish formal diplomatic relations. The Moldar want everyone to leave them alone. Zixtal scales had shifted to patterns indicating deep concern. "What about military complications?" Marcus advanced the display to show fleet movement data. 3 different species have sent observation vessels to the Kythera system. The hegemony claims they're protecting Federation interests. The Zarthak Collective says they're preventing human expansion into their traditional sphere of influence. And the Tathian Republic insists they're conducting routine patrol operations that just happen to be taking place in the same region. Meaning everyone is preparing for conflict while claiming they want peace, observed one of the aerial students. "Exactly. And the Moldar have responded to the presence of multiple military fleets by activating planet-wide defenses that make the Cathani system look welcoming by comparison." Marcus showed energy readings that made several students emit stress responses. They've created what human analysts describe as a defensive field that turns incoming projectiles into flowers. Which sounds lovely until you realize that includes the hulls of approaching spacecraft. The implications hit the students like a wave. This wasn't a classroom exercise where failure meant a poor grade. This was a real situation where failure meant people died. Marcus stood and walked slowly around the circle. "The Federation Council wants your emergency collaborative protocols because traditional diplomacy has reached a deadlock. Every attempt at formal negotiation has been interpreted as an effort to impose external authority. Every military presence has been seen as a threat requiring defensive response. Every proposal for compromise has been rejected by at least one party as incompatible with their fundamental principles." He returned to the center of the circle. "So here's today's challenge. You have 2 hours to refine your collaborative framework into something that can be implemented by real diplomats dealing with real beings who are scared, angry, and convinced that everyone else is trying to destroy everything they value. The weight of responsibility settled over the classroom like a physical presence. These were no longer students working on theoretical problems. They were young beings whose ideas might influence the fate of entire civilizations. Keening wind through crystals was the first to break the silence. Harmonic frequencies carrying notes of determination mixed with humility. Teacher Marcus, we need more information about the specific concerns of each party. Our framework requires understanding what each group actually needs, not just what they claim to want. Marcus nodded approvingly and activated detailed intelligence reports that would have been classified under normal circumstances. The Moldar fear that any formal relationship with the Federation will lead to gradual erosion of their cultural autonomy. They've studied Federation history and identified 17 cases where member species eventually abandoned traditional practices in favor of standardized protocols. The human delegation fears that failure to establish formal relations will be interpreted as weakness by other species, potentially undermining Earth's position in future territorial negotiations. They also believe that Moldar energy technology could solve critical resource scarcity problems affecting 3 human colonies. The hegemony believes that human expansion in any form threatens the careful balance of power that has prevented major wars for the past century. They want the Moldar situation resolved in a way that doesn't strengthen human influence in the region. And the Federation Council is terrified that the current standoff will escalate into the first major interstellar conflict since the formation of the galactic government. They need a solution that addresses everyone's security concerns without setting precedents that could destabilize other regions. Bleep, bloop, 7 immediately began processing the variables. Each party's stated concerns mask deeper fears about loss of control, cultural extinction, or strategic disadvantage. Standard negotiation assumes that compromise is possible, but these fears are not amenable to splitting differences. Exactly, Marcus confirmed. You can't solve this by giving everyone half of what they want, because what they want is certainty that their fundamental values will be protected. And those values appear to be mutually incompatible. Zixtal had been listening with the intensity that Marcus was beginning to associate with her problem-solving mode. What if the incompatibility is actually the solution? Marcus raised an eyebrow. Explain. The Vorthan experience with the great choosing, she said, her scales shifting to patterns that indicated she was accessing historical memory while simultaneously developing new insights. We spent generations trying to force different regions to accept unified approaches to government, resource management, and territorial organization. The wars ended when we stopped trying to create uniformity and started creating systems that allowed for controlled diversity. She stood and began moving around the circle as she spoke, a behavior Marcus had noticed often preceded her best insights. What if we approached the Moldar situation not as a problem requiring unified solution, but as an opportunity to create a new category of relationship within the Federation structure? Autonomous partnership status chimed keening wind through crystals, harmonic frequencies indicating excited understanding. A formal relationship that explicitly protects the right to maintain different approaches to governance, culture, and external relations. The Moldar get legal guarantees that Federation membership will never require them to abandon their philosophical principles, added one of the aerial students. The Federation gets access to Moldar technology and knowledge without having to impose standardized protocols. And humans get formal recognition that their exploration efforts create legitimate claims to partnership opportunities without requiring territorial control, concluded Bleep, Bloop, 7. While the hegemony gets assurance that human expansion takes forms that strengthen rather than threaten regional stability. Marcus was impressed by the speed with which his students had adapted their theoretical framework to address specific real-world complications. But he also knew that elegant solutions often collapsed when they encountered the messy realities of implementation. Excellent theory, he said. Now convince me to accept it. He moved to one corner of the room and assumed the posture of a being under enormous pressure. I'm Federation Counselor Veltar Prime, and I'm responsible for maintaining galactic peace while managing political pressures from 47 member species. Your autonomous partnership status sounds like a wonderful compromise, but it sets precedents that could undermine the entire Federation legal structure. His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too many elegant theories fail when they encountered practical politics. If I allow the Moldar to maintain complete cultural autonomy while accessing Federation benefits, every member species is going to demand the same arrangements. I'll have 47 different approaches to interstellar law, 47 different standards for trade regulations, and 47 different interpretations of mutual defense obligations. The students exchanged glances before Zixtao responded. Counselor, the Federation already manages diversity across species with fundamentally different biologies, psychologies, and social structures. Legal frameworks that accommodate crystalline hive minds, mechanical collective intelligences, and individual biological consciousness prove that uniformity isn't necessary for cooperation. Autonomous partnership status doesn't eliminate legal structure, added Keening Win-Through crystals. It creates a category of membership that acknowledges some species may require different approaches to achieving the same fundamental goals of peace, cooperation, and mutual benefit. Marcus, as Counselor Veltar, remained skeptical. You're asking me to approve a system where some species follow standard Federation protocols and others create their own approaches to the same problems. How do I prevent that from becoming an excuse for any member species to ignore regulations they find inconvenient? Because autonomous partnership status would require higher standards of accountability, not lower ones, replied Bloop 7. Species choosing alternative approaches would need to demonstrate that their methods achieve superior outcomes compared to standard protocols. And the status would be subject to regular review by independent evaluation teams representing multiple species, added one of the aerial students. Autonomous partners would need to prove their alternative approaches actually serve Federation principles better than standard methods. Marcus shifted position and character. Now he represented the hardline faction that wanted simple, definitive solutions to complex problems. I'm Admiral Chun of the Human Strategic Command, and I'm tired of complicated diplomatic arrangements that leave too many variables uncontrolled. We need clear territorial boundaries, unambiguous legal authorities, and definitive resolution of who has the right to do what in disputed space. His voice carried the frustration of someone who had seen too many carefully negotiated agreements fail when crisis situations demanded immediate action. Your autonomous partnership status creates more ambiguity, not less. What happens when the Moldar interpret Federation law differently than we do? What happens when their autonomous decision-making conflicts with Federation Council directives? What happens when we need immediate cooperation and they decide their philosophical principles require consultation periods we can't afford? The students were quiet for a moment before Zixtao approached the problem from a different angle. Admiral, what happens when you try to impose clear boundaries on beings who fundamentally reject the concept of external authority? What happens when you demand unambiguous legal compliance from species whose entire worldview is based on contextual decision-making? You get exactly the kind of standoff that's developing in the Kithra system, added Keening Win-Through crystals. Military fleets facing defensive systems that turn weapons into flowers. Diplomatic deadlock, where every attempt at formal negotiation is interpreted as cultural aggression. Autonomous partnership status doesn't create ambiguity, said Bloop 7. It acknowledges that ambiguity already exists and creates frameworks for managing it productively instead of pretending it doesn't exist. Marcus remained in character as the Admiral. You're asking me to trust that beings who reject external authority will voluntarily cooperate when Federation security requires immediate action. We're asking you to trust that beings who are intelligent enough to develop advanced technology are also intelligent enough to recognize when their long-term survival depends on short-term cooperation. Zixtao replied. And We're proposing legal frameworks that make cooperation more valuable than non-cooperation for all parties. Marcus shifted to his final character, representing the perspective that often proved most challenging to address in real diplomatic situations. I'm Moldar, speaker for the Eternal Wind, and I've spent 3 centuries watching powerful interstellar governments make promises they later abandon when circumstances change. You offer us autonomous partnership status, but what guarantees do we have that Federation politics won't eventually pressure your council to standardize our relationship? His voice carried the weariness of a being whose people had learned to distrust external assurances through bitter experience. Your Federation has 47 member species, all of whom chose integration over autonomy. What happens when they decide our special status creates unfair advantages and demand that we conform to standard protocols? What happens when the political pressures that create your current crisis make our autonomy inconvenient? This was the core challenge that Marcus had been building toward. How do you convince someone to trust institutions when their entire philosophy is based on the belief that institutional power inevitably corrupts itself? The students were silent for a long moment before Keening wind through crystals approached the problem from an unexpected direction. Speaker for the Eternal Wind, your question assumes that Federation institutions are fundamentally different from Moldar institutions. But all institutions face the same challenge. How do they maintain their foundational principles when circumstances pressure them toward convenient compromises? The Federation has survived for over 2 centuries precisely because it has created mechanisms for protecting minority positions against majority pressure, added Zixtal. Autonomous partnership status would actually strengthen those mechanisms by creating formal recognition that diversity of approach enhances rather than threatens institutional stability. But, more importantly, said one of the aerial students, autonomous partnership status gives the Moldar legal standing to challenge any future attempts to standardize their relationship. You wouldn't be dependent on Federation goodwill. You'd have legal rights enforceable through galactic courts. Marcus, as speaker for the Eternal Wind, was quiet for a moment. You offer us legal protections created by the same institutions we're being asked to trust. What prevents those institutions from changing the laws when our protection becomes inconvenient? The same thing that prevents any powerful group from completely dominating any complex system, replied Bleep Bloop 7. Interdependence. Federation stability depends on maintaining the trust of member species. Violating agreements with autonomous partners would undermine that trust and threaten the entire governmental structure. And the Moldar would retain the ability to withdraw from partnership if Federation behavior violates the terms of the autonomous relationship, added Zixtal. The agreement protects your right to leave as much as it protects your right to participate. Marcus returned to his instructor role, his expression showing both satisfaction and something deeper that might have been pride. And that, he said, is how you negotiate with people whose objections are based on fundamental distrust of institutional power. You acknowledge their concerns as valid. You provide concrete mechanisms for addressing those concerns. And you make sure that cooperation provides more protection than isolation. The classroom was quiet for a moment before Dean Tintasra Prime, who had been observing from her corner position, resonated a harmonic sequence that indicated formal recognition and deep respect. Students, she chimed, your emergency collaborative protocols and autonomous partnership status had just passed what Teacher Chin would call the final exam. You have demonstrated the ability to design solutions that address practical political pressures while maintaining theoretical integrity. Marcus looked around the circle at 23 young beings who had spent 4 days learning that diplomacy was more complicated, more challenging, and more important than any of them had imagined when the classroom door first opened to admit a human with a coffee mug and a smile that no longer frightened anyone. Tomorrow, he announced, we're going to discover what happens when your solutions actually work. As the students gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Zixtal lingered, as had become her habit. Marcus, when you said we passed the final exam, did you mean we're finished with the simulation? Marcus finished packing his materials and picked up his coffee mug. No, Sixtad. I meant you're ready for the real test. Tomorrow, a delegation from the actual Federation Council is coming here to discuss implementing your frameworks in the Kithra system. Her scales shifted through several patterns before settling on one he had never seen before, something that seemed to combine anticipation, determination, and absolute certainty that whatever came next, they were ready for it. Marcus, she asked as he headed for the door. Yes. Thank you for showing us that we're capable of more than we thought we were. Marcus paused at the threshold. Thank you for proving that hope is stronger than fear when you give it room to grow. The door closed behind him, leaving the classroom empty, but somehow charged with possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time since arriving at Zephyrian Academy, Marcus was completely confident that his students could handle whatever the universe decided to throw at them, because they had learned the most important lesson of all, that the galaxy's most dangerous problems weren't technical or political or even philosophical. They were human problems, requiring human solutions, applied with the wisdom that came from seeing the universe through as many different eyes as possible.